My husband let his mistress throw me out of the anniversary party of the very company we built, so I hit back in a way he will never forget. Tell me, if you were in my place, what would you have done? I am Eleanor Whitmore, born into an old money family, not the flashy, attention-seeking kind of new wealth, but the quiet, understated kind of prosperity passed down from one generation to the next, the kind that whispers rather than announces itself. The Whitmore family built its legacy in law and real estate over 4 generations, creating a reputation for integrity and strategic thinking that opened doors across the business and social circles of the Northeast. My childhood was one of concealed privilege, a place of high expectations but abundant resources, where I learned early that real power often lives behind the scenes. At Harvard Business School, I was one of just 12 women in a class of 120, a ratio that required me to be twice as sharp and work twice as hard for half the recognition my male classmates received by default. Still, I excelled, graduating with honors in corporate finance and a thesis on strategic partnerships that would later become the foundation of everything I built with Charles, my husband. Charles Langford was the golden boy of the MBA program, magnetic, ambitious, and gifted with a natural leadership quality that made people want to follow him even when they weren't entirely sure where he was heading. He was brilliant too, though his intelligence showed more in his ability to synthesize complex ideas and sell them convincingly than in the methodical analysis that came naturally to me. Our partnership began during a second-year collaborative study group, when we were assigned to create a comprehensive business plan for a fictional hospitality company. I provided the financial model and strategic framework, while Charles developed the vision and presentation. Our professor called it the most sophisticated graduate-level business plan I've seen in 20 years of teaching, and our classmates joked that we should actually start the company we had built on paper. That joke became reality 6 months after graduation, when Charles came to me with a proposal that would shape the next 2 decades of my life. He had identified an opportunity in the boutique hotel market, high-end properties in second-tier cities that could command premium rates without the operating costs associated with major urban centers. It was a sensible idea, but one that required significant upfront capital and industry connections that normally took years to build. I brought both into the partnership. My family's assets provided the initial investment, while my father's law firm represented several major hospitality groups and could offer both legal services and industry introductions. Charles brought the vision, the charisma, and the relentless drive to turn our shared dream into something real. Langford Hospitality Group was founded with Charles and me as equal partners, a structure that reflected not only our combined financial contributions, but also the acknowledgement that success required both my analytical skill and his ability to build relationships and close deals. The early years were marked by 18-hour workdays, endless late-night strategy sessions, and the kind of close collaboration that blurred the line between professional partnership and personal intimacy. The romance developed slowly, born out of shared ambition and mutual respect rather than fiery passion. We were both intensely career-focused, understanding each other's drive and supporting each other's goals. By the time we married, it felt like the natural progression of a relationship that had already proven itself successful in every arena. The wedding reflected our shared values and social standing, elegant but not ostentatious, held at my family's estate with 200 guests, representing the perfect blend of family tradition and business opportunity. I was happy wearing my grandmother's pearl necklace and holding roses from my mother's garden, while Charles's groomsmen included several former classmates who were rising stars in their own respective fields. The early years of our marriage also coincided with the fastest growth period of Langford Hospitality Group. My strategic vision and financial acuity, combined with Charles's relationship-building skills and his natural talent for sales, created a synergy that seemed unstoppable. After the first property was purchased, we turned it into a profitable boutique hotel and used that success to secure financing for an aggressive expansion plan. 3 years later, Langford Hospitality Group owned 12 properties across 8 states, each carefully selected for its potential to serve affluent travelers who valued authenticity and exclusivity over brand recognition. I handled all financial analysis, negotiated acquisition deals, and developed the operational systems that ensured consistent profitability across the entire portfolio. Charles focused on marketing, client relations, and high-level networking, cultivating loyal guests and referral partners. The division of labor seemed natural and efficient, but it also created a pattern that would cause problems as our success grew. Charles became the public face of the company, the charismatic CEO who gave interviews to hospitality trade publications and served as a keynote speaker at industry conferences. I was the strategic mind behind the operation, but my contributions were largely invisible to the outside world. This dynamic was reinforced by the subtle sexism that continues to permeate much of the business world. Journalists and industry analysts found it easier to write about a visionary male entrepreneur than to acknowledge the complex partnership that truly drove the company's success. Charles, to his credit, initially tried to ensure I received proper recognition, but as the praise and attention increasingly focused on him, he began absorbing the narrative that positioned him as the primary architect of the company's achievements. The 2008 financial crisis nearly destroyed Langford Hospitality Group, along with thousands of other companies that had expanded aggressively during the boom years. Our company's revenue dropped 60% as business travel evaporated and leisure travelers canceled expensive vacations. 3 of our 12 properties were foreclosed on, and the company came within weeks of complete collapse. It was my quick thinking and financial resources that saved it. I liquidated my personal investment portfolio, mortgaged my family's summer home, and negotiated with lenders to restructure our debt under terms that allowed the company to survive. Charles focused on maintaining relationships with the remaining guests and gradually rebuilding our customer base as the economy recovered. The crisis should have strengthened our partnership by highlighting our complementary skills and shared commitment to a common vision. Instead, it marked the beginning of a subtle shift in the dynamics of our marriage. Charles emerged from the crisis with renewed confidence and ambition, eager not only to reclaim our previous success, but to build something even bigger. I, on the other hand, was exhausted from the stress of nearly losing everything we had built, becoming more cautious and focused on sustainable growth rather than aggressive expansion. We were 2 people with 2 fundamentally different approaches, and that created the first real tensions in our marriage. Charles became frustrated with what he saw as my conservatism, while I worried that his ambition was steering us toward the same kind of overexpansion that had almost destroyed the company once before. These disagreements, played out both privately and at work, began creating an emotional distance even as our business partnership remained effective. The recovery period saw Langford Hospitality Group not only return to profitability, but also achieve the kind of industry recognition Charles had always craved. We were featured on magazine covers, won multiple awards for innovation in guest experience, and became a case study in business schools for successfully navigating the financial crisis. But as the public visibility grew, the narrative around our success increasingly centered on Charles's leadership and vision. My role was minimized or omitted entirely, reduced to vague mentions of strong operational support or family backing, overshadowing the real contributions I had made to every aspect of the business. I told myself public recognition was irrelevant as long as our marriage stayed strong and the business continued to thrive. I had been raised to value substance over appearance, results over praise. But the constant erasure of my work began to affect me in ways I didn't fully recognize, creating a sense of invisibility as I gradually lost confidence. The changes in Charles were even more pronounced and troubling. Success had always mattered to him, but as Langford Hospitality Group grew and his public reputation expanded, he began craving not just achievement, but admiration. He started spending more time on speaking engagements and industry conferences, positioning himself as a thought leader and visionary rather than simply a successful entrepreneur. His increased focus on personal branding meant he became less attentive to the day-to-day operations that I continued managing. I found myself handling more and more strategic decisions, while Charles focused on what he called laying the groundwork, public relations and networking activities that fed his ego but offered little direct value to the business. Our family life was affected too. Charles became increasingly obsessed with his professional image, spending money on a personal stylist, expensive cars, and fashion accessories he believed were necessary to maintain the persona of a high-powered CEO. I, someone who had always preferred understated elegance over extravagance, found his new priorities both confusing and frustrating. The distance between us grew steadily, beginning with differences in social preferences and evolving into a wider gap in both emotional and physical intimacy. Charles wanted to attend every gala and industry charity event, seeing them as opportunities for connection and personal brand building. I preferred intimate gatherings with genuine friends, finding the endless cycle of work-related socializing exhausting and ultimately hollow. Our conversations, once centered on business strategy, personal dreams, and shared interests, increasingly revolved around logistics and professional obligations. We still worked well together in a business context, but the easy intimacy that had defined our early relationship was slowly replaced by a polite formality that neither of us named, but both of us felt. The introduction of Sloane Kerrigan as Charles's new executive assistant marked the beginning of the final phase of my marriage, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Sloane was everything I was not: young, blatantly ambitious, and entirely focused on advancing her career through strategic relationships rather than through competence and hard work. At 26, Sloane had an MBA from a second-tier business school and 3 years of experience at a mid-level marketing firm that had gone bankrupt. Her resume looked impressive at first glance, but lacked substantive accomplishments, full of buzzwords and self-promotional language that I had always found irritating, but that my husband found intriguing. "She brings a fresh perspective," Charles explained when I questioned the hiring decision. "We need people who understand how business operates in the new economy." What Sloane understood was how to make herself indispensable to powerful men through a blend of flattery, eagerness to assist, and the suggestion that only she truly understood their vision and potential. She stayed late without being asked, remembered personal details a wife might forget, and offered Charles a kind of uncritical admiration that fed his increasingly inflated ego. I watched this unfold with growing unease, but I told myself my worries stemmed from jealousy rather than judgment. Charles had every right to hire assistants who complemented his working style, and if Sloane helped him be more effective, then her presence would ultimately benefit the company we had built together. What I didn't realize was that Sloane was positioning herself not just as Charles's assistant, but as his strategic advisor, and eventually as his lover. The late-night meetings that kept Charles in the office until 9 or 10 had less to do with business strategy and more to do with the personal attention and validation he felt had been missing from our marriage for months. Charles's sudden interest in fitness and fashion, the mysterious calls he took in private, the weekend business trips that seemed to multiply without explanation. But I had spent so many years focused on the business side of our lives that I had lost touch with the emotional rhythm of our marriage. I noticed the changes in Charles, but assumed they were the result of the pressure of running a growing company rather than the thrill of a new relationship. Meetings I had always attended were suddenly bypassed, with Charles explaining that I didn't need to waste my time on day-to-day matters. Meanwhile, Sloane was invited to strategic planning sessions, client dinners, and industry events, where she was introduced as Charles's key advisor rather than his assistant. The shift happened gradually, but intentionally, positioning Sloane as my replacement in every aspect of Charles's professional and personal life. By the time of the 15-year anniversary of Langford Hospitality Group, the ballroom of the Peninsula Chicago had been transformed into a showcase of dazzling success, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light over tables overflowing with expensive flowers and fine wine. 500 guests represented the elite of the hospitality industry, along with local politicians, major clients, and social influencers who defined success within their circles. I had spent weeks planning the details of the event, working with caterers and decorators to create an atmosphere that reflected both the company's refined brand and the personal aesthetic that had always been my signature. I wore the emerald silk gown Charles had chosen for me, telling myself that his involvement in selecting my dress meant he still cared about how I looked. But the moment I stepped into the ballroom, I felt something was wrong. Conversations abruptly stopped when I approached, replaced by the kind of awkward small talk people use to fill uncomfortable silence. Old friends and colleagues seemed unable to meet my eyes, and I noticed them exchanging loaded glances when they thought I wasn't looking. The whispers were subtle but unmistakable. I had spent enough time in corporate environments to recognize the signs of office gossip, and I gradually realized I was the subject of speculation and pity rather than celebration. Everyone in the room seemed to know something I didn't, and their attempts to hide that knowledge only made my discomfort deepen. When I finally approached Charles near the stage, where he was speaking with a group of industry executives, his reaction confirmed my worst fears. The flicker of irritation on his face when he saw me was quickly masked by polite indifference, but I had seen enough to understand that my presence was unwelcome rather than appreciated. "Oh, Eleanor, you made it," Charles said, his tone suggesting that my attendance at our company's celebration was unexpected or inappropriate. The circle of men around him immediately dispersed, leaving me standing alone with my husband in the middle of a crowded ballroom. Charles made no effort to introduce me to the executives he had been speaking with, made no mention of me during the conversation about expansion plans and market opportunities, and didn't even acknowledge my role in the company. "I should get back to networking," Charles said, his eyes scanning the room for more important people to talk to. He walked away without another word, leaving me standing beside the stage like a piece of misplaced furniture. The whispers after Charles left grew louder and sharper, as if his public dismissal of me had given the gossips permission to speak more openly about whatever tragedy they believed they were witnessing. I heard stray pieces of conversation that made my stomach twist as I began to understand. "It's a shame she doesn't even know about Sloane." "How long has it been going on?" "She's the last to know, as always." The pieces of the puzzle I had unconsciously assembled for months suddenly came into brutal clarity. Charles's late nights, his weekend trips, his sudden passion for fitness and fashion, the increasing distance between him and our marriage, all of it now made undeniable sense. When Sloane appeared beside me in a crimson dress that seemed designed to announce victory, I felt whatever illusions I had left collapse. The young woman's smile was sharp and predatory, and her words carried a casual cruelty that made it clear she had rehearsed this moment for weeks. "Eleanor, sweetheart," Sloane said, her voice tinged with that fake sympathy that made the insult cut even deeper. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This event is only for business partners and key stakeholders." I answered automatically, relying on decades of business experience and legal training. "I am a key stakeholder. I own 17% of this company." But Sloane's response revealed the depth of the scheme built around my exclusion. "Used to," she corrected, her voice dripping with false compassion. "That's in the past, sweetheart. Charles was planning to talk to you about some recent changes." The implications of her words were staggering, revealing that Charles had not only been unfaithful, but had taken legal and financial steps to diminish my role in the company without my consent or knowledge. The betrayal was not just personal, but professional, not just emotional, but economic. Before I could fully process the meaning of what I'd heard, security appeared at my side. The same men who had greeted me warmly when I arrived were now arranged to escort me out of my own event. The transformation from honored guest to unwelcome intruder was completed in minutes. "Security, remove this useless woman," Sloane announced, her voice echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. The line was clearly crafted for maximum humiliation, intended not just to remove me from the celebration, but to permanently destroy my reputation and social standing. Every conversation in the room stopped as 500 pairs of eyes turned to witness my public execution at the hands of my husband's mistress. I looked desperately toward Charles, hoping he would intervene or at least acknowledge the injustice unfolding. Instead, I saw him turn his back and continue speaking animatedly with a group of potential investors, as if the degradation of his wife were nothing more than background noise to more important business concerns. The walk to the exit felt endless, though I maintained my composure thanks to years of training in social grace and professional decorum. I didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't create the kind of spectacle that would give the gossips more material to feed on. I simply walked away, carrying with me the dignity that comes from understanding that sometimes the strongest reaction to humiliation is refusing to let it break you. In the silence of the Tesla in the parking garage, I finally allowed myself to think clearly about what had just happened and what it meant for my future. The signs of Charles's betrayal had been everywhere, but I had been too focused on the business and too trusting in our marriage to see them for what they truly were. But this was not simply about discovering an affair or even the public humiliation of being thrown out of my own company's event. It was about the systematic erasure of my contributions to everything I had built with him, the deliberate diminishing of my role and value that had been unfolding for months, maybe even years. I opened my phone and began making the calls that would change everything. My first call was to David Rosenthal, my personal financial advisor, and the person who had helped me manage my investments throughout our marriage. David had warned me for years about the risks of investing so much of my assets into Langford Hospitality Group, but I had always believed that diversification mattered less than maintaining alignment between us as a married couple. "David, it's Eleanor. I need you to execute a series of transactions first thing Monday morning." The urgency in my voice immediately caught his attention. "Eleanor, it's after 10 on a Saturday night. Is everything all right?" "I want to liquidate my entire stake in Langford Hospitality Group, all $17 million. The silence stretched long enough for me to wonder whether he'd hung up. David was one of the most seasoned financial professionals I knew, but even he seemed stunned by what I had just said. "Eleanor, that's a major decision that could trigger all kinds of legal and financial complications." "Monday morning, David," I interrupted, my voice carrying a finality that shut down any further debate. "I also need you to freeze all joint accounts and credit cards. Anything tied to Charles is to be frozen immediately." David's next question made it clear he understood exactly what my instructions implied. "Are you filing for divorce?" "Just execute the transactions, David," I said, then hung up before I had the chance to second-guess myself. My next call was to Lauren Moreau, the travel agent who had planned our anniversary trip, a 3-week vacation meant to celebrate both our marriage and the company's success. The trip had been my idea, an attempt to reconnect with Charles. "Lauren, I need to cancel the trip." "Oh no. The cancellation fees will be enormous, are you sure?" "I'm sure. Cancel everything." By the time I pulled up to the estate where we had lived for 8 years, my phone was flooded with calls from Charles. 37 missed calls and climbing, each one carrying the increasing panic he must have been feeling. I turned off my phone, sitting in the car on the circular drive, staring at the house that had once been featured in magazines as an example of refined contemporary design. I had loved this home once, had worked with architects and decorators to create spaces that reflected both our success and our shared aesthetic. Now it stood as a monument to a life built on deception and sustained by my own blindness. The woman who had walked out of that ballroom, the woman who had convinced herself she was valued and respected while being systematically sidelined and replaced, was gone. I was someone entirely different now, someone shocked into clarity and ready to act to reclaim her dignity. I spent the rest of the weekend documenting everything in a systematic way. My home office held years' worth of meticulous records. telling the true story of the development and growth of Langford Hospitality Group. The original formation documents listed Charles and me as co-founders and equal partners, a legal structure that reflected the actual contributions each of us made at the time. The loan documents showed that my personal assets had secured the $3 million credit line that saved the company during its early cash flow crisis. Without my financial support and my family's connections, Langford Hospitality Group would have collapsed long before it had the chance to succeed. Bank statements, investment reports, and legal agreements painted a picture of sustained financial contribution that far exceeded my official 17% ownership. I had personally invested nearly $30 million into the company over more than 2 decades, money that funded expansions, bridged crises, and enabled the rapid growth that made Charles's name prominent in the industry. By 8 a.m. on Monday, I had photographed and organized all the documents, reconstructing a story that Charles's press releases had conveniently erased. I was not just a silent partner or a supportive wife. I had been the financial architect behind everything the company had become. At 9:01 a.m., I lightly tapped the send button on an email addressed to the entire board of directors of Langford Hospitality Group. The content was brief and formal. Eleanor Elizabeth Langford hereby notifies the board of directors of the immediate liquidation of my 17% ownership stake in Langford Hospitality Group, effective immediately. Documentation in support of this decision is attached. I hit send and felt something shift deep inside me. The woman who had spent decades bolstering someone else's dream had finally chosen to prioritize her own interests, and the feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. The response was immediate and dramatic. My phone began ringing within seconds, starting with David Rosenthal confirming that the liquidation order had been executed, followed by increasingly urgent calls from board members, company executives, and eventually Charles himself. I let every call go to voicemail, each ignored ring symbolizing another layer of control and manipulation being stripped away. An hour later, a message from Sloan arrived, sent from an unfamiliar number, with the same natural arrogance that proved she still believed she had authority over my decisions. "Mrs. Langford, this is Sloan. Perhaps we should grab coffee and talk through last night's misunderstanding." The audacity was astonishing, but it also revealed something important about Sloan's psychology. She genuinely believed my actions were the result of emotional turmoil rather than strategic calculation, that a misunderstanding could be resolved through conversation and manipulation. My response was short and final. "There is no misunderstanding, and from now on, call me Miss Whitmore." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning. Langford Hospitality Group's stock price had dropped 15% overnight as news of my liquidated shares spread through industry networks. Major investors were demanding explanations, and several pending deals had been paused, pending clarification of the company's financial stability. The Langford Hospitality Group boardroom was an impressive space, with floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city skyline, and a glossy conference table large enough to seat 50 people in leather chairs, more expensive than most people's cars. I had attended hundreds of meetings in this room over the years, but I had never felt more powerful or more certain of my position than I did on that Tuesday morning. The board members were already seated when I arrived, their expressions a mix of confusion, concern, and in some cases, fear. They were seasoned business leaders who understood that my actions threatened not only Langford Hospitality Group, but also their own reputations and investments. Charles burst through the door just 5 minutes after the meeting was scheduled to begin, his usual composure completely shattered. His perfectly styled platinum hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and the air of authority he once carried had dissolved into raw desperation. Sloan followed him into the room. "Eleanor," Charles said, his voice tight with tension and disbelief. "What have you done?" I remained seated, my tone calm and professional. "Good morning, Charles. I'm exercising my rights as co-founder and major shareholder. You've triggered a company-wide financial crisis. Our stock is in free fall." 3 major deals have been suspended. I didn't answer his question. Instead, I opened my briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents representing my contributions since the company's inception. These are the original incorporation documents, I said, sliding the folder across the glossy table for the room to see. And this is the loan guarantee I personally signed to keep the company from going bankrupt. And here, I continued, lifting a thick bundle of papers tied with a red ribbon, are the records of the $29 million in direct capital contributions I have personally invested into Langford Hospitality Group over the past 2 decades. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of papers rustling as the board members reviewed documents telling a story none of them had fully understood until now. What I built, Charles, I can dismantle, I continued, my voice steady and certain. Langford Hospitality Group exists because of my financial support, my family's connections, and my strategic planning. Without my continued backing, this company would not have survived. Charles's face went pale as he realized my actions were not a wounded wife's emotional outburst, but the calculated move of a sophisticated businesswoman fully aware of the power she held. The board will never agree to this, he said weakly, glancing around the table for support he did not receive. The board has no choice, I replied. If $27 million in working capital cannot be generated before the market closes tomorrow, Langford Hospitality Group will technically be insolvent. I recommend you call an emergency shareholders meeting to discuss new leadership and strategic direction. I gathered my documents and rose to leave, my movement signaling that the meeting, and the consequences of underestimating me, were over. If you need anything, contact my attorney, I said, walking toward the door with the confidence of someone who had already begun writing the next chapter of her life. Behind me, I could hear frantic whispers about an empire collapsing, the sound of powerful men realizing that their success had been built on the goodwill of a woman they had foolishly underestimated. The divorce proceedings that followed were swift and devastating for Charles. With the financial documents and legal records, my attorney was able to demonstrate that I had been the primary financial architect of Langford Hospitality Group from the beginning. The settlement reflected not only the value of my official ownership stake, but also the intellectual property, strategic planning, and financial guarantees that had enabled the company's growth. I left with nearly $40 million, while Charles was forced to sell his remaining shares to cover the company's debts and legal obligations. Langford Hospitality Group continued under new management, but its period of rapid expansion was over. Without my financial backing and strategic oversight, it could not sustain the same trajectory. Meanwhile, Charles faced a future entirely different from the one he had imagined when he chose to replace his devoted wife with Sloane. The business community that had once praised his vision and leadership now understood that much of his success had been built on resources and expertise he no longer had. Sloane, whose relationship with Charles had been founded on power and status rather than genuine affection, quietly disappeared from his life as his prospects dimmed. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was living in an old family estate, surrounded by the formidable sepia-tone portraits of my ancestors. I discovered a new passion: photography. My first exhibition featured a series of black and white portraits of women in business, each image capturing the strength and determination required to build something meaningful in a world that often values women's support roles more than their leadership. The opening was crowded with art collectors, business leaders, and many who had witnessed my humiliation at the Langford Hospitality Group anniversary months before. It was at this gallery opening that I saw Charles for the first time since the divorce. He looked older, smaller, diminished in ways that went far beyond his financial decline. The commanding presence that once drew attention in every room had been replaced by something almost confused, as if he were still trying to understand how his life had changed so drastically and so suddenly. "Eleanor?" he said hesitantly, stepping toward me during a quiet moment between conversations with collectors. "You look happy." And it was true. Even I could feel it. I looked genuinely radiant, a beauty that had been absent for years. I wore a simple black dress I had chosen myself, my hair styled the way I liked it, not the way Charles preferred, and the confidence I had lost long ago had finally returned. His apology, when it came, was more thorough than I had expected. "I'm sorry for everything, for the affair, for taking credit for your work, for making you feel invisible in your own life. I don't know how I ever justified treating you that way." I looked at the man who had been my partner for more than a decade, and what rose in me was closer to compassion than anger. "Thank you for saying that. I hope you find what you're looking for." I walked past him and out into the cool night air, not looking back because there was nothing behind me worth holding on to. The life I had built since leaving Langford Hospitality Group belonged entirely to me. Smaller in scale, perhaps, but infinitely richer. My story became a source of inspiration for other women who found themselves in similar circumstances. My photography continued to grow in recognition, leading to exhibitions in major galleries and a book contract for a portrait collection documenting women who had turned personal breakdowns into professional triumphs. But perhaps more importantly, I had learned something profound about myself. I had discovered that real strength doesn't come from supporting someone else's dream, but from having the courage to pursue your own. The woman who had been thrown out of her own company's celebration returned as someone far more formidable, not because I sought revenge, but because I had finally recognized my own worth and refused to accept anything less than respect. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself after being underestimated, share your story below. I read every comment. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to follow the channel and tap the like button so the algorithm knows these voices matter.